The winter of 1892 hung heavy over the small farming town of Exeter, Rhode Island. Snow blanketed the hills, the roads lay in silence, and the houses seemed to shrink against the icy wind that tore through the countryside. For most families, winter meant hardship, but for George Brown, it meant something far darker. One by one, his family was being taken. The disease was called consumption then. Today we know it as tuberculosis. But in Exeter, it was something more sinister. The illness did not strike quickly like influenza or smallpox. Instead, it consumed its victims slowly, wasting them away. First came the cough, faint at first, but lingering, rattling in the chest. Then came the fever, the weakness, the slow collapse of the body. Loved ones grew thin, their cheeks hollowed, their skin pale. It was as if life itself was being drawn out of them night by night, breath by breath. George Brown had already buried too many. His wife, Mary Eliza, was the first. She had been a strong woman, the anchor of the family, but consumption broke her down. He buried her in Chestnut Hill Cemetery, a modest grave on frozen ground. Soon after, his eldest daughter, Mary Olive, followed. She was only in her 20s, a kind, gentle girl whose songs once filled their home. Her voice was silenced, body wasted. Another grave dug, another blow. And still the sickness did not stop. Now George's only son, Edwin, was coughing, struggling to walk, his strength fading by the day. He had left for Colorado, chasing the hope that mountain air might heal him, but it was no use. He returned to Exeter weaker than before, his skin grey, his body trembling. George could only watch in silence as his last son slipped away. And then there was Mercy. Mercy Lena Brown, George's youngest daughter. She was just 19 with dark hair and a soft, quiet presence. She too had been struck by the disease, and in January of 1892 she died. The ground was frozen too hard to dig, so her body was placed in a crypt waiting for the thaw. That should have been the end of it. Another tragedy, another grave. But in Exeter, whispers began to spread. Too many deaths, too many taken from one family. The townsfolk began to murmur of old fears, of things that science could not explain. Some said it was not disease at all, but something feeding on the Browns. Something that rose at night, invisible, pulling the life out of Edwin, keeping him weak, keeping him dying. A vampire, they whispered. Not the kind from foreign folklore, but something local, something older. At first George ignored it. He was a man of reason, not superstition. But as Edwin grew weaker, the whispers grew louder. Neighbors spoke in hushed voices, voices that carried even through closed doors. They said one of the Brown women was still alive in some way, rising from the grave, drawing life from the boy. And there was only one way to stop it. By March, the pressure became too much. A council of neighbors and local men approached George. They asked permission to open the graves, to look upon the bodies, to see which one might still hold power. George resisted. He had buried his wife, his daughters, his family. How could he desecrate them again? But when he looked at Edwin, coughing, gasping, barely clinging to life, what choice was left? If superstition could save his last child, could a father deny it? On the morning of March 17, 1892, as the sun rose weakly over the snow, the men of Exeter gathered with shovels, lanterns, and grim resolve. They would dig up the Brown women. They would look upon their remains. And if the whispers were true, they would put an end to the curse, no matter the cost. And in the center of it all, Mercy Brown waited. Her body lay in the crypt, untouched by time, hidden in winter's embrace. A girl who should have been gone, yet whose story was only beginning. The small farming community of Exeter had always been a quiet place. Its people lived by the rhythm of the land, sowing in spring, harvesting in autumn, enduring the long winters in silence. Yet in the winter of 1892, silence was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, and filled with whispers. The Brown family was not the only household touched by consumption. Across Rhode Island, entire families had been wiped out, one coughing body after another. But the Browns' tragedy stood out. Wife, daughter, another daughter, and now Edwin, all claimed by the same wasting sickness. To neighbors, it was no longer coincidence. It was a pattern, and patterns demanded explanation. When Edwin returned from Colorado, his condition worse than when he had left, suspicion deepened. His eyes were sunken, his skin gray, his cough ragged. At night, some claimed to hear him gasping in his sleep, as though something unseen pressed down on his chest, drawing the very breath from his lungs. Soon, the whispers grew sharper, more insistent. It's not just sickness, some said. It's someone or something. They spoke of old folk tales, stories passed down from Europe, reshaped by New England winters, tales of the dead who did not stay dead, of the buried who rose at night to feed upon the living. Vampires. No one called them that at first, not openly. The word was too strange, too foreign. But they knew the signs, when one family suffered loss after loss, when the sick grew weaker despite every remedy, when the graves seemed to hold secrets rather than peace. And so eyes turned to the brown women buried in Chestnut Hill Cemetery. Mary Eliza, the mother, gone first. Mary Olive, the eldest daughter, her voice silenced by the disease. And Mercy, the youngest, lying in her crypt because the ground had been too hard to dig. It was Mercy who drew the most whispers, not because she had been the last to die, but because her death had seemed too swift, too sudden. Consumption usually wasted its victims slowly. Mercy's decline had been sharper, her burial fresher, and her body had not yet been committed to the frozen earth. In the minds of frightened neighbors, these details mattered. They suggested that Mercy had not truly left, that her spirit, or something darker, might still linger. George Brown heard the rumors but dismissed them. He was a man of reason, not prone to superstition. He had seen consumption take his wife and daughters. He knew what it looked like. He knew what it was. But reason mattered little when fear ruled a community. The neighbors came to him not once, but many times. Their voices lowered, urgent, insistent. "We have to be sure. We have to open the graves." At first, George resisted. He could not bear the thought of his loved ones disturbed, their bodies dragged back into the light. Yet each night, Edwin grew weaker, and each day the whispers grew louder. By March, George was a desperate man. He looked at his son, pale and trembling, and asked himself a question that would haunt him forever. What if the neighbors were right? What if there was even the slightest chance that superstition could save him? It was not faith in folklore that broke George's will. It was love. A father's love for the last child he had left. And so reluctantly, he gave his consent. On March 17th, as the snow began to melt and the ground softened, the people of Exeter gathered in the cemetery. Men carried shovels. Women clutched rosaries. Some came to help, others to watch, all drawn by morbid curiosity. There was no laughter, no idle chatter, only the crunch of boots on snow and the creak of wooden handles as shovels bit into earth. They would open the brown graves. They would look upon the bodies, and if one of them was found uncorrupted, if one of them still seemed alive, they would know who to blame. The ground was hard, the air cold, the work brutal. Yet as they dug, one thought guided their hands. If the dead were feeding on the living, then the dead must be stopped. And beneath that soil, Mercy Lena Brown waited. The morning of March 17th, 1892, dawned grey and brittle. A thin fog clung to the bare trees, curling around their black limbs like smoke from a hidden fire. The people of Exeter gathered at Chestnut Hill Cemetery, their breath visible in the cold air. Men carried shovels, picks, and lanterns. Women stood behind them, shawls wrapped tight, murmuring prayers beneath their breath. George Brown was there, his face pale, his eyes hollow from grief and sleepless nights. He had not wanted this, not any of it, but desperation had broken him. His only son, Edwin, lay at home, coughing out what little life remained. If there was even a chance this ritual could save him, George could not deny it. The men began with Mary Eliza's grave. George's wife, gone for nearly a decade. The soil was heavy, frozen in patches, and it took hours to unearth the coffin. When the lid was pried open, the sight was as expected, A skeleton. Fragile bones collapsed into themselves, no flesh remaining, the villagers muttered. This was not the culprit. Next was Mary Olive, George's eldest daughter. She had been dead for several years, and when her coffin was opened, the results were the same. Bones, brittle and still.
Nothing unusual, nothing unnatural.
The crowd stirred uneasily. If not them, then who? At last, all eyes turned toward the crypt where Mercy had been laid to rest. Unlike her mother and sister, her body had not been buried deep in the ground. The earth had been too frozen in January, and so she had been kept in a simple stone crypt above ground, waiting for spring thaw. Two men stepped forward, hands trembling as they unlatched the crypt door. The hinges groaned, echoing across the cemetery like a warning. Inside, Mercy's coffin sat in the cold shadows. When they pried it open, the air changed. The murmurs stopped. Silence fell so thick it pressed against the ears. There she was, Mercy Lena Brown. Her body did not look like a girl who had been dead for months. Her face was pale, but her skin still clung to her bones. Her hair lay dark and smooth. Most terrifying of all, when the men inspected her chest, they found blood in her heart and veins, as if it had only just been beating. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some women clutched their children tighter. Men exchanged uneasy glances. To them, the answer was clear. She was the one. She had not truly died. She had been feeding on Edwin night after night,
Rising from the coffin to steal his life.
A physician from Providence was present that morning, summoned by George in a last attempt to temper the villagers' fears. He stepped forward and explained calmly that it was natural. Mercy's body had been preserved by the cold. The winter air inside the crypt had slowed decay. The blood in her heart was no mystery. It was what happened when a body froze. Nothing supernatural, nothing unholy. But his words fell flat against the weight of superstition. The villagers had seen with their own eyes what science could not explain. A body that looked alive when it should not. And fear, once rooted, does not listen to reason. They demanded action. Mercy's heart must be cut out, burned. Only then could
Edwin be freed from her grip.
George Brown stood silently, torn between shame and desperation. He had already lost so much. If this final act could save his son, could he refuse? And so, against the protests of the doctor, the villagers set about their grim work. They cut open Mercy's body, removed her heart and liver, and set them to flame on a nearby stone. The smell of burning flesh rose into the cold March air. Some turned away. Others watched with grim determination. When the organs had burned to ash, they gathered the remains and mixed them with water. This concoction, foul and bitter, was carried to Edwin. He was made to drink it, a ritual of protection, a final desperate cure. The crowd dispersed slowly, leaving George alone with the remains of his daughter. Mercy's body was finally buried properly in the thawing ground. Laid beneath the earth, she had been denied for months. But though her body rested, her story did not. The ritual had been performed, the vampire destroyed, yet Edwin did not recover. Within 2 months he was dead, and all George Brown had left was silence. Silence, and the knowledge that his daughter's grave had been desecrated in vain. The flames that consumed Mercy Brown's heart and liver left more than smoke rising above. Chestnut Hill Cemetery, they left a stain across the conscience of a community. When the ritual was done, when the ashes had been gathered and mixed into a foul liquid for Edwin to drink, the people of Exeter walked away in uneasy silence. Some believed they had rid themselves of an evil. Others whispered doubts, though never loud enough to be heard above the collective fear. George Brown stood apart from them all. He had not wielded the knife, had not touched the fire, but he had allowed it.
A father, desperate to save his last living child,
had agreed to desecrate the body of his youngest daughter. The image would never leave him, her pale skin, preserved by winter's cold, her heart pulled from her chest, her remains fed to her brother as if horror itself could be medicine. That night, Exeter slept more soundly, or at least they pretended to. The whispers quieted, the gossip stilled. People told themselves that the threat was gone. that Mercy's restless spirit would no longer rise. But for George, peace was an illusion. Edwin still coughed in the dark hours,
Still struggled for breath.
his body failing despite the ashes he had swallowed. Day by day, George watched his son fade. The villagers looked on with pity, some with grim satisfaction, as though Edwin's continued decline proved that the Browns had been cursed from the start,
A few muttered that perhaps the ritual had not been done correctly.
that Mercy's influence lingered. Others argued that the sickness was too strong, that even fire and ash could not undo it. The physician who had warned against the exhumation returned briefly, shaking his head at the futility of it all. Tuberculosis, he said again, as though the word itself should end the discussion. But Exeter had already chosen its truth. They had seen Mercy's preserved body, had smelled the burning organs. Science could not erase what their eyes and hearts told them. By May, Edwin's body had withered to a husk. His once broad shoulders were sharp bones beneath his skin, his face hollow, his voice a faint rasp. On May the 2nd he drew his last breath. The ashes of his sister, forced upon him as salvation, had done nothing. Mercy was gone. Edwin was gone. George Brown was left a widower with no wife, no daughters, no son. The Browns' farmhouse stood silent, the rooms that once echoed with laughter, and song now carried only the hum of the wind through empty halls. Neighbors no longer gathered at the door. The family that had drawn the community's fear was gone, their tragedy complete. Yet the story did not end there. Mercy Brown became more than a daughter, more than a victim of disease. She became a legend, whispered in taverns, retold around hearths, passed from one frightened generation to the next. Some swore that the ritual had worked, that Mercy's shadow had vanished from Exeter forever. Others whispered that it had not, that her spirit lingered in the cold earth, waiting. George Brown never spoke publicly of what had been done. He attended church, worked the land, lived out his days with quiet grief. When he walked through town, men nodded respectfully, but women still lowered their voices, for how could anyone truly look him in the eye?
Knowing that his daughter's body had been carved open before them all.
The silence around Mercy's name gave it power. Children dared each other to walk past Chestnut Hill Cemetery at night. Some swore they saw a figure in white among the graves, pale and waiting. Others claimed to hear coughing in the wind, faint and hollow, carried from the farmhouse where the Browns once lived.
Mercy's death and her.
Desecration became the last vampire tale of New England, in a land that prided itself on progress, where railroads and telegraphs carried modernity forward. Superstition had still ruled the hearts of a small farming town, and that superstition had consumed what little George Brown had left. Mercy Lena Brown was laid beneath the earth, her stone marker modest and cold. But her story was not buried. It lingered in whispers, in fearful glances, in the unease that crept into the hearts of those who had once stood around her coffin and watched her heart burn. She was gone, and yet she was not. Exeter tried to bury more than just the Brown family. In that cold spring of 1892, they tried to bury the whispers, the shame, the memory of fire rising from a young girl's heart. But stories are like roots. They dig deep, they spread, and they find cracks in even the hardest soil. At first, the talk stayed local. A few farmers at the mill, voices low, remembering the sight of Mercy's body, her skin intact, her heart still heavy with blood. Women at the well repeated the tale, embellishing it in quiet tones, adding flourishes of dread. Her eyes were open, some whispered, though no one had seen such a thing. Her lips were red with blood, said another, though the truth was more ordinary. Fear does not need accuracy. It needs only repetition. Children caught wind of the tale and turned it into dares. They whispered Mercy's name at dusk, daring each other to walk past Chestnut Hill Cemetery after nightfall. Some swore they saw her white dress glimmer between the trees. Others claimed to hear her voice in the wind, calling out from beneath the frozen ground. Whether they lied or truly believed, Each retelling gave her more life than the grave had taken away. But the whispers did not stay within Exeter's boundaries. Newspapers from Providence caught scent of the strange ritual, and reporters made their way to the quiet town. What they found was scandalous enough to fill columns. Farmers and housewives digging up a teenage girl, carving her heart, burning it to ash,
and feeding it to her dying brother.
To the city readership, it was grotesque and ridiculous, proof that rural New England was still shackled by medieval superstition. Headlines sneered, articles dripped with condescension, painting Exeter as a town of fools. Yet even mockery could not kill the fascination. For every reader who laughed at the absurdity, another felt a shiver at the image of a preserved body lying in a crypt,
untouched by decay.
Soon, the story traveled further. New York papers picked it up, then Boston. By the end of 1892, the tale of the Exeter vampire was known across the Northeast. The word vampire itself clung stubbornly to Mercy's name, though no one in the town had spoken it aloud on that March morning. Reporters supplied what the villagers had implied. Mercy Brown was no longer just a farmer's daughter. She was a monster, or perhaps a victim of monsters. For George Brown, the spreading story was another wound. He had lost his family, then his dignity, and now he lost his privacy. Strangers speculated about his dead daughter in print, reducing his grief to sensational headlines. Some writers portrayed him as a superstitious fool. Others painted him as a tragic father, caught between love and madness. But George himself never spoke. He endured the gossip in silence, his sorrow locked behind tired eyes. The villagers, too, grew restless under the attention. To outsiders, Exeter became a joke, a place where vampires roamed and reason faltered. But within the community, the story twisted into something else, a reminder that death was never far, and that sometimes the old ways felt more comforting than the new. Even as germ theory slowly gained ground, the memory of Mercy's exhumation remained, not just because of what was seen, but because of what was felt. Fear had seeped into the soil, into the graves, into the air itself. Science could not touch that.
Logic could not erase it.
And so while doctors wrote about tuberculosis, while scientists spoke of invisible bacteria, mothers warned their children of shadows that lingered at the foot of the bed. Fathers sharpened stakes, not for monsters, but for the idea of monsters. In that liminal space between knowledge and dread, Mercy lived on. By the close of the century, her name had already entered folklore. She was the girl who would not stay dead. The vampire of Rhode Island, the pale figure haunting New England's final years before the modern age. The whispers in Exeter had become echoes across America. And once a whisper becomes an echo, it never truly fades. Long before Mercy Brown's name filled American newspapers, the word vampire had already crossed seas and centuries. Europe's villages had whispered of them for generations, creatures of the grave, pale and hungry, feeding on the living. In Serbia, in Hungary, in the shadowed forests of Romania,
families had dug up their dead,
searching for signs, flesh still fresh, blood still wet, eyes open as though watching. When Exeter's story reached the wider world, many were stunned. America, young, proud, industrializing, was supposed to be free of such old-world superstitions, yet here it was. Repeating the same rituals that peasants in Eastern Europe had carried out 100 years before. In the Balkans, stories told of men like Arnold Powell, said to rise from the grave in the 18th century. When villagers dug him up, they found his body uncorrupted, his mouth stained with blood. They staked him, burned him, scattered his ashes. These tales spread so far they caught the attention of European scholars, soldiers, even monarchs. The Habsburg Empress Maria Theresa herself issued decrees against vampire hunting rituals, alarmed at the hysteria. Now, more than a century later, America had its own vampire. Mercy Brown's name joined that lineage, though she had never left Rhode Island. To readers in London or Paris, the story was familiar, even expected. To readers in Boston or New York, it was horrifying precisely because it was not supposed to happen here. American commentators drew the comparison openly. Have we not advanced beyond such nonsense? They asked. But beneath their scorn was unease. If the old world terrors could resurface in modern New England, what did that say about the progress of civilization itself? For folklorists, Mercy's case became proof that superstition knows no borders. Fear of the restless dead, it seemed, was not confined to Europe's medieval past. It thrived even in America's industrial present, where trains roared across the landscape and telegraphs stitched the nation together with invisible threads. Beneath all the iron and steam, human beings still feared the grave.
And not just in whispers.
Reports of consumption vampires had surfaced in other New England towns before Exeter, in Connecticut, in Vermont. Families had quietly exhumed relatives, convinced that the dead were feeding on the living. Most of these stories remained local, never making it to city papers. But Mercy Brown's case broke through, amplified by the strange detail of her preservation. Her pale body, untouched by rot, became an icon of horror. Even abroad, writers took notice. In England, where spiritualism and seances were flourishing, the story of Mercy Brown merged with the fascination for life after death. Some spiritualist journals cited her case as evidence that the veil between worlds was thinner than science dared admit. Others mocked it as proof of America's lingering primitivism. But perhaps the strangest echo came years later, from a man who never met Mercy, never set foot in Rhode Island, but who read the accounts with fascination. His name was Bram Stoker. In the 1890s, Stoker worked as a theatre manager in London, while quietly researching folklore for the novel that would one day make his name immortal, Dracula. Historians have long debated whether Stoker ever read the reports of Mercy Brown. Some insist he did, pointing to uncanny similarities: a preserved corpse, blood in the heart, villagers consumed by fear. Others argue it was coincidence that Stoker's vampire owed more to Eastern Europe than to New England. But whether or not he read the clippings, the timing is undeniable. Mercy Brown's body was exhumed in 1892. Dracula was published in 1897. The world's most famous vampire emerged just 5 years after. America's last great vampire ritual. Coincidence or inspiration? Across the ocean, the legend grew. Mercy Brown became more than a Rhode Island girl. She became part of a global story, a reminder that the vampire was not confined to the castles of Transylvania or the villages of the Balkans. It lived in the heart of America too, in a quiet farming town where grief and fear had dug open a grave. Exeter never intended to join the old world tales, but once Mercy's heart was burned, her story belonged not just to Rhode Island, not just to New England, but to the world. By the mid-1890s,
London was buzzing with strange new fascinations: spiritualism,
séances, ghost photography, and lurid tales of the supernatural. And in a quiet study in Chelsea, a man named Bram Stoker was weaving together notes, legends, and reports into a novel that would forever define the vampire. Stoker was no folklorist by trade. He worked as the business manager of the Lyceum Theatre, tending to the career of famed actor Sir Henry Irving, but at night he scribbled into notebooks, collecting fragments of European folklore, historical accounts, and contemporary reports of disease and death. In those notebooks were references to tuberculosis, to exhumations, and to the superstitions that clung to rural communities. And in the early 1890s, just as Stoker was finalizing his manuscript, newspaper reports of a strange case in Rhode Island were circulating across the Atlantic. The story of Mercy Brown, a young woman whose corpse had been exhumed, whose heart was found with blood, whose organs were burned to save her brother, was the kind of tale that fit neatly into Stoker's growing mythos. Did he read the reports? Historians are divided. Some argue there is no direct evidence. No surviving notes mention Mercy by name. Others believe the timing is too perfect to ignore. The detail of the preserved body, the ritual burning, the consuming of ashes, these were not just vague echoes of European lore. They were contemporary, American, and chillingly real. Consider the timeline. Mercy's exhumation in 1892 captured attention across the United States and abroad. By 1893, the story had been printed in London. Stoker, always hungry for authentic horror, was actively gathering research during those same years. By 1897, Dracula was published. Within the novel's pages, echoes of the New England vampire panic seemed to stir. Lucy Westenra, the beautiful young woman whose wasting illness mirrors tuberculosis, becomes a vampire after death. Her loved ones exhume her, only to find her body disturbingly preserved. When her coffin is opened, she looks alive, rosy cheeks,
Fresh lips, as though sleep had merely claimed her.
The resemblance to the descriptions of Mercy's body is uncanny. Then there is the ritual of destruction. Lucy's heart is pierced. Her head severed, her body burned, save those she threatens. It is not identical to Exeter's ritual, but the thematic parallel is striking. The dead feeding upon the living. The family forced to desecrate a loved one. The mingling of science and superstition. Whether Stoker read Mercy's tale directly or absorbed it through whispers and second-hand accounts, the case belongs in the cultural soil from which Dracula grew, and it is here that Mercy's tragedy becomes more than local folklore. She becomes part of the literary DNA of the world's most famous vampire. What makes this possibility so haunting is that Mercy herself left no words, no diary, no testimony. She died at 19, her voice erased by disease and superstition. And yet, her silence may have echoed into fiction that gave the vampire a voice louder than any folkloric tale before it. When Dracula was released in 1897, it was not an immediate sensation, but over time it consumed the world. Plays, films, novels, all sprouted from Stoker's creation. And beneath them all, if one looks closely,
Lies the shadow of a Rhode Island grave.
some scholars caution against overstating the link. Stoker's main inspiration came from Eastern European lore, from books on Transylvania, from the chilling accounts of 18th century vampire plagues. But even they admit the idea that Stoker's pen might have been nudged by the fresh, raw tale of a girl named Mercy is too tantalizing to dismiss. In this way, Mercy Brown became something she never asked to be, a bridge between history and myth, between the soil of New England and the ink of Victorian England. She was a farmer's daughter, buried in the frost of 1892, and perhaps she was also the hidden muse for one of literature's darkest creations. Bram Stoker gave the world Dracula, but perhaps, just perhaps, Mercy Brown gave Dracula his most human face. By the time Mercy Brown's name filled headlines in 1892, the old ritual had already been practiced for generations in quiet corners of New England. But hers was different, not just for the strange preservation of her body, but because it happened under the eyes of a changing world. A world with newspapers, telegrams, trains. A world where superstition could no longer hide in the fields. It could be carried, mocked, and dissected by strangers hundreds of miles away. The ridicule was swift. Providence papers wrote with sneers. New York editors called Exeter's ritual barbaric, an embarrassment to America's modern image. One columnist even described it as a medieval act, clinging to soil better suited for corn than corpses. Exeter had wanted to cure a boy. Instead, they became infamous. For George Brown, the father who allowed it, shame must have weighed as heavily as grief. To lose a wife and 3 children was unbearable. To lose them while strangers ridiculed his name was worse.
And for Edwin, the son who drank.
His sister's ashes in milk, it was agony without cure. Within 2 months, Edwin was gone, joining Mercy and the others in Chestnut Hill Cemetery. Their deaths left a grim arithmetic. The ritual had failed. Superstition had not saved a single life. And in the shadow of that failure, the ritual itself began to falter. It was not just ridicule that killed it. Science was rising. Germ theory, once dismissed as fanciful, now marched forward with authority. Doctors explained tuberculosis not as a curse, but as a bacterium, mycobacterium. Tuberculosis, tiny rods, visible only under a microscope, passed by coughs clinging to clothing, infecting entire households. Science gave the same answers that folklore once did. Why whole families sickened together. Why death seemed to stalk lineages, but with evidence instead of fire and ash. By the turn of the century, medical campaigns began to change habits. Public health officers urged ventilation, sunlight, sanitation. New Englanders built sanatoriums on mountain ridges, where patients could breathe clean air instead of sharing the close, damp quarters that had spread disease. These were imperfect solutions, but they were solutions rooted in reason, not in desecration. And slowly, the old beliefs eroded. No longer did families gather by lamplight to whisper of the dead feeding on the living. No longer did fathers break open coffins to protect their children. Instead, they turned to doctors, to medicines, to institutions. The vampire, at least as a literal threat, was laid to rest. But folklore never dies as neatly as science hopes. Even as the rituals ended, the memory of them lingered. The very mockery that shamed Exeter also immortalized it. City readers laughed at the idea of New England vampires, but they never forgot them. And laughter, as history often proves, can carry a story further than belief ever could. By the early 20th century, folklorists were already recording the old tales, preserving them as curiosities of America's superstitious past. What was once fear became entertainment. What was once ritual became legend. Yet in places like Exeter, the laughter still stung. For those who had watched their families wither away from tuberculosis, the rituals had not been comedy, they had been desperate attempts at survival. To be remembered only as a joke was a cruel injustice. Still, progress was relentless. By the 1920s, the vampire panic had entirely faded. No more exhumations, no more burned hearts. The cemeteries grew quiet again, the earth unbroken, the dead left to their rest. And yet, in a way, Mercy Brown never rested. Her story survived because it stood at the border of two worlds, the old world of superstition and the new world of science. She was the final echo of a centuries-old belief, and her grave became the marker of where fear ended and folklore began. The panic was gone, but the legend had only just begun to grow after the smoke from Mercy Brown's burned heart drifted into the cold Rhode Island air. The ritual should have ended with silence, but it didn't. What Exeter thought of as a private, desperate act quickly escaped its borders. Newspapers carried the story to Providence, to New York, and soon across the Atlantic. And with that, Exeter's grief became a battleground between superstition and science. Doctors were the first to respond. For decades, they had been trying to push back against the shadow of tuberculosis, known then as consumption. They recognized its symptoms all too well: the pale skin, the wasted bodies, the long coughs that brought up flecks of blood. But while doctors studied bacteria, their patients whispered of vampires. The clash revealed something deeper than disease. To scientists, TB was caused by germs, tiny organisms unseen by the naked eye. To the people of Exeter, the very idea was laughable.
How could something invisible kill entire families?
What they could see was far more convincing. A daughter, buried months before, lying in her coffin with blood still in her heart. The preservation of Mercy's body was the spark. Physicians explained it calmly. Winter soil, cold enough to halt decay, had acted as a natural refrigerator. But those who had peered into her coffin remembered something else. A face that seemed too alive.
Organs that seemed too fresh.
It didn't matter what science said. The image had burned itself into their minds, and no microscope could erase it. Public health officials tried to counter the story by turning it into a teaching moment. They wrote in newspapers that Mercy's case was not proof of vampirism, but rather a tragic demonstration of how TB passed silently through households. They begged people to avoid close quarters, to air out their homes, to stop sharing cups and utensils. But such advice felt feeble compared to the drama of a vampire legend. Telling a grieving family to open windows had no poetry, no power. Telling them to dig up a grave did. And so the scientific explanations, rational, careful, clinical, were often drowned out by the folk stories that traveled faster, carried in whispers, in sensational headlines, in fearful imagination. The harder science tried to explain Mercy away, the more the legend grew. Even journalists who mocked Exeter's actions could not resist describing them in vivid, horrifying detail. They wrote about her preserved face, about Edwin drinking his sister's ashes. They condemned the superstition while feeding the very curiosity that kept it alive. Every attempt to debunk Mercy also immortalized her. In this way, science was trapped. To explain was to repeat. To dismiss was to spread. Mercy had become more than a girl. She was a symbol of the battle between two ways of seeing the world. One way trusted microscopes, the other trusted shovels and fire. And in 1892, neither side fully won. Yet science was patient. As the years passed, germ theory proved itself again and again. Families who followed medical advice saw fewer deaths. Sanatoriums offered some relief. Slowly, the vampire panic withered, not because people suddenly trusted doctors, but because the rituals themselves had failed.
Edwin had died. Others had died.
The burned hearts never cured anyone. Still, the unease remained. Even as doctors claimed victory, they knew superstition was never truly gone. They saw it in the way families hesitated to trust them, in the way whispers of curses lingered in villages. And for folklorists and writers, that lingering unease was gold. It kept Mercy's story alive long after her grave was closed. In the end, science did confront superstition, but not by erasing it. Instead, the confrontation transformed Mercy Brown into something larger than either side intended. To doctors, she was an example of how ignorance resisted progress. To her neighbors, she was a final attempt to save a family. And to history, she became both a case study in disease and the last true vampire of New England. Mercy Lena Brown was buried twice, once in the frozen soil of Chestnut Hill Cemetery, and once in the collective imagination of the world. And unlike her body, her story never decayed. In Exeter, she was remembered first as tragedy. To her father, George Brown, she was simply a daughter lost to disease. To her brother Edwin, she was the last hope, whose ashes he drank in a desperate act of faith. To the neighbors, she was the girl they exhumed to break a curse. These memories were private, painful, and raw. But the newspapers that spread her name turned her into something else, a legend. Soon, Mercy Brown belonged to more than Exeter. She belonged to New England, to America,
To the world.
Folklorists carried her story into books about the vampire panic. Teachers used her case to show how superstition once gripped entire communities. Ghost tours and storytellers recited her tale by candlelight, weaving fear and fascination in equal measure.
Her name was no longer whispered, it was performed.
By the 20th century, Mercy's grave had become a site of quiet pilgrimage. Her headstone, a simple marker, stood among weathered stones in Chestnut Hill. But unlike the others, hers drew visitors from across the country. Some came with flowers, some came with notebooks, scribbling inspiration for their own stories. Others came with stranger intentions, leaving coins, dolls, or scraps of paper with messages, "Protect me, forgive me, help me." So many visitors chipped away at her gravestone for souvenirs that caretakers had to replace it. To touch Mercy's stone, to take a piece of it, was to feel a connection to a legend, like pocketing a fragment of folklore itself. Her influence reached far beyond the cemetery. Scholars compared her case to vampire tales in Europe, linking Rhode Island's rituals to centuries-old beliefs in Eastern Europe, where bodies were exhumed and burned for similar fears. She became the American chapter of a global story, a reminder that superstition does not belong to one culture, but to humanity itself. Writers, too, found her irresistible. Though Bram Stoker may or may not have known her name, modern authors certainly did. Novels, short stories, and even songs invoked her as the last New England vampire. In some, she was a ghost wandering frostbitten fields. In others, she was imagined as a restless vampire, forever young, forever hungry. Horror films borrowed her imagery: blood in the lungs, exhumed coffins, the girl who looked alive in death. And yet, even in fiction, Mercy never fully escaped her humanity. Unlike Dracula, she was not a monster by choice. She was a victim of disease, of fear, of desperate ritual. That duality gave her a strange, haunting power. She was terrifying but also tragic. In academic halls, she became a lesson. Students learned how communities turn to folklore when medicine fails. They studied how fear can drive people to desecrate their loved ones. They debated whether Mercy was exploited by her neighbors or whether she became their last attempt at survival. Her story offered not only chills, but insights into psychology, sociology, and the clash between progress and tradition. Today, more than a century after her second burial, Mercy Brown still stirs unease. Walk through Chestnut Hill Cemetery at dusk, and you may find a shadow at her grave. A girl, pale in the twilight, standing among the stones. Or perhaps it is only your imagination, fueled by the story you've carried with you, the story that refuses to die. Because in the end, Mercy's true immortality lies not in superstition, nor in science, but in story. Her name is repeated in whispers, in classrooms, in horror novels, in hushed retellings on stormy nights. She is alive not in her body, but in the countless voices that keep her legend alive. For George Brown, she was a daughter lost. For Exeter, she was a symbol of hope twisted into fear. For us, she is something stranger, a bridge between life and death, belief in science, history, and myth. Mercy Brown may have been laid to rest in 1892, but her grave has never truly closed. And so long as people crave stories that unsettle, stories that linger in the quiet hours of night, the vampire girl of Rhode Island will never die.
Because the dead may sleep, but legends never rest.